Lia Thomas, a transgender swimmer, has smashed numerous records at the Ivy League Women's Swimming and Diving Championship. Now, this is a woman who's transitioned from being male. As a male athlete, Will Thomas was ranked number 462 in terms of college swimmers. As a female athlete, she's ranked number 1. Ella, is this a tale of triumph of adversity over the odds, or is something else going on here?
Look, this isn't just, you laugh because when you watch the footage of that race, it is remarkable because it is someone with a body who is taller and bigger and musclier and
6'4".
Yeah, remarkably stronger than any of the other women in the pool, any of the women in the pool. And it is just patently unfair. I mean, it sounds cliche now. It's become, thankfully, so many people have pointed out how unfair it is that it sounds cliche to say it is unfair. And yet, official sporting bodies are still maintaining that this is acceptable. And the funny thing is that it really, the kind of short-sightedness of the consequences for allowing someone like Lia Thomas to beat women who have trained for years and given up their lives to try and have this kind of space in which they would have a fair shot at being a champion. The short-sightedness of this, I think they haven't realised, because the reason we have women's and men's sports is because we understand that bodies are different. The reason we have Paralympics and the Olympics is because we understand that if you threw a swimmer with one arm into a race with a bunch of swimmers with both arms, it's quite obvious who would win. Yeah. And the sheer scale of the difference between your average woman, even like, you know, a chunky person like me and Lia Thomas, is just, it's mind-boggling. And the only thing I can think of is that there is a fear among sporting bodies that they will be called transphobic if they deny that this is any kind of reality that's sustainable. And I think, you know, Lia Thomas is just someone who, whether opportunistically, whether it's just an individual who's trying to get along, I'm sure is very passionate about the sport. And, you know, it's not necessarily about her. It is about the cowardice involved in sport that cannot stand up and say, and when it grandstands on doping and all sorts of other things, cannot stand up and say, this is not fair, this shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Charlie, I mean, this women's sport is finished, essentially, if this is allowed to go on.
It's precisely what I was about to say. This is the end of women's sport if this approach to attendance and participation is continued. I mean, I thought that this level of infiltration, and that's essentially what it is, wouldn't happen after the weightlifting debacle at the Olympics.
Yeah.
You know, I thought with the number of athletes, unfortunately, and I would say quite cowardly, not answering questions about that person's involvement.
Laurel Hubbard.
Yeah. I thought that was disappointing. I thought that was an opportunity to say, now, this is the biggest stage of sport and you're letting this happen and how are we meant to compete at that level? But they didn't. None of the sporting bodies did. It was just a few, basically, people on Twitter or the occasional columnist in the Times or whatever, but nobody actually really wanted to take that full throttle. Now it's happening on a way more egregious scale at a much smaller stage. You know, this is university swimming.
Yeah.
It's bigger in the States than it is here for sure, but it's not exactly, you know, the Premier League or whatever. Even then, we are now finally seeing some sort of reaction, but way overdue, long overdue.
I mean, it's worth thinking back to the kind of Laurel Hubbard debacle, you know, in that Summer Olympics where the BBC wrote like maybe a 3,000, 4,000 word, you know, gushing, praising piece about Laurel Hubbard beating the odds, you know, suddenly finding herself in this sport when really, you know, she's actually pretty third rate anyway. Even against biological women, she didn't do that well.
Yeah.
But, you know, so it's good to see, I suppose, the tide is turning in a sense.
Yeah, well, yeah, Charlie's right to say that it's long overdue, but I think it's because you have to realise how serious the threat of being called a transphobe is for people. It's like when people call you a racist and you're not a racist. It's a horrible thing to be called. It's a bigoted thing to be called. And the fact that it is just thrown around so loosely makes people very afraid. And if you are a young, you know, athlete who's trying to make a bit of a name for yourself as well as compete in your sport, you're going to be very aware that you're on a kind of public stage, particularly on social media, in which people are not forgiving of the kind of comments you made. But the fact that there has been this basically institutional capture at the level of sporting bodies, that we've seen it in other institutions like universities, like at the BBC, the influence of groups like Stonewall, lobbying groups, who have basically created a situation in which any discussion of not just trans rights versus women's rights and all that mess of that row, but just about biological reality in the place where biological reality matters, sport. It doesn't matter in lots of other areas of life, but it matters in sport. The fact that there's been a kibosh on not just any debate on it, but any discussion of it, shows you how censorious the nature of this has become. And I think how afraid people are to speak out, because once you do speak out, you are basically either attacking Lia Thomas personally, or you are being a bigoted transphobe, which no one wants to be. And so I think tackling that kind of basically calling out the emperor and saying that he has no clothes is the first step to then getting to a place in which we are not turning over, as Charlie points out, loads of women's lives on the basis of one individual. I think also that balance needs to be addressed.
And finally, I mean, we saw at the Winter Olympics, figure skater, young Russian figure skater was widely lambasted as, Russian drug cheat for taking some angina medicine last year at some point. What do you make of the contrast between that, what is, by all accounts, quite a minor doping infraction, and probably certainly not something that could make you into a brilliant figure skater, and Lia Thomas, where this is within the rules, this massive advantage is okay, and probably something we're supposed to all praise.
Well, I think Ella touched on that comparison in her first response on this whole issue, that there is a wild flap over doping, which is often quite justified. I think we've had some very dirty Olympic Games recently, a number of events. And then, of course, as you point out, this essentially superhuman ability you get by being the wrong biological sex in the wrong category. You're right. I mean, no analogy is perfect. And in sporting, that's definitely true. But this is, for all intents and purposes, cheating. This is more cheating in Lia Thomas's case than someone taking some medicine over a year ago at the age of 14 and 15, which will have a possibly negligible effect on their performance as a skater. But just to touch on what Ella just said there before, perhaps I was quite strong when I said that they were cowardly under the nation's international spotlight for saying that. But I
think you have a point.
I would stand by. I would stand by. Yeah. But at the same time, you're right to raise that people do go to jail for saying transphobic things. It is a crime. And so, but if they're not going to set, I mean, they are icons of sport. They are people who inspire young girls to do this kind of stuff. If they're not going to say it, who is? Yeah. If you want to be untouchable and create a new trend and actually push past finally what I think is hopefully peak woke at this level where we have men swimming in women's competitions. If we are going to push past that, it's going to take powerful, influential, non-political people to stand up and say, this is wrong.